Trump is now threatening protesters, not rioters, with heavy force as we're also getting big LA protest updates and as Gavin Newsom problems getting bigger and bigger. RFK just fired an entire CDC vaccine advisory panel, and why public health experts are calling it one of the darkest days in modern medical history with severe consequences incoming. Now, Trump just made it easier for convicted felons to get their hands on deadly weapons, and why a judge just threw out Justin Baldoni's $400 million bombshell lawsuit against Blake Lively, but the legal war between them is far from over. We're talking about all that and much more on today's brand new Philip DeFranco show, you daily dive into the news, starting with this. We need to talk about these huge updates around the LA protests, starting with those Marines they deployed to the city, with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth saying, due to increased threats to federal law enforcement officers in federal buildings, approximately 700 active duty U.S. Marines from Camp Pendleton are being deployed to Los Angeles to restore order, saying we have an obligation to defend federal law enforcement officers even if Gavin Newsom will not. But just to start with a quick correction there, for some reason Hegseth continues to say that the Marines are coming from Camp Pendleton, which is a massive base near San Diego, but in looking into it, they're actually coming from the middle of the desert out in 29 Palms. But regardless, right, other officials have added that the Marines won't have the ability to arrest people, and instead, they're there just to guard federal buildings and personnel. And as of this morning, they arrived in LA and they're awaiting deployment to specific locations throughout the city. But then also, separate from the specifics, just the idea of American troops being deployed on American soil, it's continued to be an extremely controversial issue. Some even comparing the US now to Russia, China, North Korea, and other totalitarian regimes that regularly use troops to quell civil unrest. Now, with this whole situation, one thing that local law enforcement and the National Guard are probably going to have to be dealing with are a number of looters. Right? And that, not because the protests or protesters in general are going around looting the city, but instead it ends up being part of a common pattern that we see when large-scale protests happen where people take advantage at night to cause some chaos. Right? Such as in downtown LA, where you had places like the large Apple store being broken into last night. And with that, you had city officials condemning those acts with, for example, Mayor Karen Bass writing, "Let me be clear, anyone who vandalized downtown or looted stores does not care about our immigrant communities. You will be held accountable." But then also being a sentiment that was echoed by Governor Gavin Newsom online, and actually I spoke with House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries about this as well, and he told me,
we can't allow bad actors to infiltrate those movements and to engage in provocations on the ground that then will delegitimize the ability of those righteous movements to persuade the American people that we need change.
But Jeffrey's also saying destruction of property is never acceptable, assaulting law enforcement officers is never acceptable, and anyone who engages in it should be held accountable. But then he also added, we also don't want to see this type of executive branch overreach where Donald Trump is perhaps trying to intentionally inflame the situation and cause more chaos on the ground than might otherwise exist. You know, that last thing that he said, it's a major talking point surrounding these protests. Is the Trump administration purposefully trying to make them worse? Because beyond just Jeffries making that claim, we saw Mayor Bass telling reporters yesterday,
we need to stop the raids. This should not be happening in our city. It is not warranted, and the only thing it does is contribute to chaos. This was chaos that was started at Washington, D.C. On Thursday, the city was peaceful. On Friday, it was not, because of the intervention of the federal government.
And notably, Newsom's been making similar claims since at least Friday when he wrote, inciting and provoking violence, creating mass chaos, militarizing cities, arresting opponents. These are the acts of a dictator, not a president, which he then essentially restated in a reply to White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller. Which, speaking of Miller, he's been in the trenches online defending the Trump administration's handling of all this with, for example, him tweeting, what does Governor Newsom mean when he keeps saying the presence of ICE officers and the troops necessary to protect their lives and duties are inciting riots? He's adopting the argument of the insurrectionists. Enforcing federal immigration law in our city is not allowed, and we will riot if you do. Newsom isn't trying to suppress the anti-American revolt. He's encouraging it. But then in general, the two having a lot of back and forth, with Miller and other MAGA stands claiming that the protests in California and the state government's alleged lack of a response is an insurrection, which Newsom and many others said that really the only people defending a modern insurrection is a lot of MAGA and Trump after he pardoned 1,500 Jan 6ers, which is also notably something Jeffries touched on in our conversation, essentially saying that this is hypocrisy or projection.
Donald Trump and the Republicans have zero credibility, zero, on the issue of law and order. We will not let them lecture America on this subject. When Donald Trump, on his first day in office, he didn't lower health care costs or lower the high cost of living as he promised on day one. And on his first day in office, he pardoned hundreds of violent felons who brutally beat police officers on January 6th. That's what he did. And now wants to turn around and lecture America as if he's standing up for law and order. Get lost. These people are phony in that regard.
Right, and if you've watched yesterday and today, it's probably become clear that Newsom is consistently at the center of the story. Makes sense. He's the governor where the protests are happening, and he's kind of long been a boogeyman for conservatives. In fact, so much so that you have figures like Speaker of the House Mike Johnson saying some questionable things about it. With the most recently today being asked if Newsom should be arrested, which is a whole thing we talked about yesterday, and you had Johnson saying,
"That's not my lane. I'm not going to give you legal analysis on whether Gavin Newsom should be arrested, but he ought to be tarred and feathered, I'll say that."
But then Newsom using the opportunity to bash the GOP as a whole by claiming that it was on brand that they would want to use an 18th century punishment. And he's actually just been going off against the Trump administration and their allies. I mean, it's been pointed out that the cost of deploying troops in the National Guard is going to be enormous at around $134 million. With Newsom then using that stat to ask whether that money would be better spent on vet nutrition assistance. He also called out Republicans who claim that LA and California is full of violence and pointed out that many red states have far worse murder and violent crime rates. Also, one of the weirdest things that happened was Trump claimed that he spoke to Newsom last night, which Newsom replied, "There was no call, not even a voicemail. Americans should be alarmed that a president deploying Marines onto our streets doesn't even know who he's talking to." But then John Roberts of Fox News saying, "Here's the call log," while also, I guess, not realizing that it was from 1 o'clock in the morning on June 7th, which notably, it wasn't yesterday, it wasn't the day before yesterday, it was the day before that. So seemingly, Trump lied or confused 3 days ago with yesterday. With that also just being a small taste of the swings that Newsom's been making online. But then to go back to the protests, one of the debates that we've actually seen pop up have been about masks, specifically about whether protesters and ICE agents should be able to conceal their identities. And notably, the use of masks among officers is something that Jeffries has chimed in on, with him arguing that America is a democracy, not the Soviet Union, and he pledged to identify officers who try to hide their faces. And while you have many agreeing with that take, there's also many pushing back on it. And there you have people arguing that they're masking to protect themselves, and that includes Todd Lyons, the acting ICE director.
So a lot of agencies were invited to come out 2 weeks ago in Los Angeles where we ran an operation where ICE officers were doxxed. So let's just say that again. People are out there taking photos of the names, their faces, and posting them online with death threats to their family and themselves. So I'm sorry if people are offended by them wearing masks, but I'm not going to let my officers and agents go out there and put their lives on the line and their family on the line because people don't like what immigration enforcement is. They are wearing those masks because we ran an operation with the Secret Service where we arrested someone that was going online, taking their photos, posting their families, their kids' Instagram, their kids' Facebooks, and targeting them. So let me ask, is that the issue here, that we're just upset about the masks? Or is anyone upset with the fact that ICE officers' families were labeled terrorists?
And so I wanted to know what your reaction is to that.
Of course, anybody who unlawfully targets the families of ICE agents should be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. That's not what we're talking about in this particular instance. Does an ICE agent really need to wear a mask to snatch a 2 or 3 year old American citizen who's battling cancer away from their families and from their communities? Is that what needs to happen? That doesn't have anything to do with a legitimate threat to the safety and security of that particular enforcement action.
Right, and then separately, as far as whether protesters should be allowed to wear masks, you had Jeffrey saying that, that should be a decision made at the state and local level, with him then noting that he actually backs such a policy in his home state of New York. But then when it comes to ICE agents, he argued that this is a matter of safety and security, not just for the American people, but also of law enforcement officers themselves. I'm saying, one, in terms of the Homeland Security officials who are snatching people off the streets in masks, that violates everything that we know about how law enforcement should be conducting themselves openly and honestly in the United States of America. But then he also added, two, that it sets up a very dangerous situation where you again allow for bad actors to potentially pretend to be or imitate Homeland Security officials. And saying at some point in time, you may have a circumstance where someone actually gets kidnapped thinking that they're being apprehended by a so-called ICE agent when it turns out to be a bad actor. But then another aspect of this whole situation is you have DHS claiming that these raids, they're to get criminals off the street. And they even had a thread that showed the huge number of criminals that were taken off the street, which is, it's sarcasm, it was like 5. That low number, it just fueled anger and criticism that these raids, they're targeting everyday people who are just trying to make a living to feed and house their families. Which actually brings us back around to the protests, because DHS also tried to prove that protesters were violent and chose the worst clips ever. There were people saying in the nearly 2-minute compilation there was maybe one violent moment where it looked like someone threw an object at police. Also, Customs and Border Patrol had their own proof which showed a firework going off near police. And there, fireworks have definitely been used and pointed at police on occasion during these protests, and without a doubt, fireworks can be dangerous, and please don't throw them at police. But in general, the protests have largely continued to be extremely peaceful and border on boring. It really really the only violence that we've seen happen are in areas where protesters are confronted by ICE agents and police, which for many, it fuels the allegations that this is a manufactured crisis. And then finally, with this situation, it may end up just being the tip of the iceberg, right? Because similar protests have now popped up in cities all over the country. With seeing, for example, NBC News counting at least 25 rallies, some that had small turnouts and others that drew hundreds or thousands. And I mean, just up the California coast, there were anti-ICE protests in San Francisco drawing an estimated 9,000 people. And that came as there were already protests in the city over the weekend, which led to dozens of arrests and 2 officers reportedly getting injured. And then if you hop to the other side of the country, you had around 24 people arrested in New York City at a protest outside of Trump Tower. And with that, you had people like Florida's Republican Representative Anna Paulina Luna tweeting, "Notice how these riots never happen in red states. California can blame Trump all it wants, but this chaos is the direct result of years of soft-on-crime, pro-criminal policies. This would never happen under real law and order leadership." But plot twist, it is also happening in red states, starting with several cities in Texas. For example, in the capital city of Austin, you had some local outlets saying the demonstrations began peacefully, but there was eventually a standoff between protesters and the Texas Department of Public Safety, who deployed tear gas. And there you had the state's Governor Greg Abbott writing, "Between the Austin Police Department and the Texas Department of Public Safety, more than a dozen protesters were arrested in Austin. Peaceful protesting is legal, but once you cross the line, you will be arrested. Fuck around, find out." There was then also at least one person reportedly arrested in Dallas during a protest, with reports again saying that it started out peaceful, but eventually declared unlawful. And according to CBS News, a firework exploded near police officers and some people threw bottles at police. And like I said, there are dozens of protests happening all over, so this is just a small example of what we're seeing. And again, it is worth noting that a lot of these events have been peaceful. And even in cities where there were arrests, you have some officials noting that most events were peaceful. Though with that, I will say we're likely going to see how crazy everything might get this weekend as groups are planning mass protests on June 14th. And so with all that, one, I'd really love to know your thoughts and reactions to the updates and the news that we're seeing. So leave those comments down below. And two, if you want to watch the full Hakeem Jeffries interview, I think it comes in at around just over 25 minutes. I've got a link for you in the description, and it's over on the PDS News Clips YouTube channel. And then you've got even more news we got to talk about in just a minute. But first, it is official. It is time for cold brew. And if you haven't made your own at home yet, what are you doing? Personally, I've been on this for weeks, and it tastes way better than anything I've gotten at some cafe. Plus, I'm in full control. No weird syrups or mystery milk, just pure coffee goodness made exactly how I like it. And with that, I got to say shout out to today's sponsor, Trade Coffee, making cold brew easier than stealing the last slice of pizza. Just scoop the coffee, add the water, toss it in the fridge overnight, boom. You've got cafe quality cold brew waiting for you like a loyal dog waiting to love you. And Trade's cold brew collection, it's no joke. They've teamed up with 15 elite roasters across the country to create beans specifically for cold brew. And hey, I may be biased, but even just cracking open the bag, I'm just in heaven. The smell, it just hits you. It's glorious. I almost just want to stare at it for a minute. And with all of this, the gear is idiot proof. The taste is next level, and the price, totally reasonable. Plus, if you sign up for a cold brew subscription right now, Trade will actually send you a free Harrio cold brewer. Free! It's just one more reason Trade is the #1 coffee subscription in the US, and I get the hype. So hey, here's the move. Scan the QR code or go to drinktrade.com/DeFranco and you can thank me later, because your mornings are gonna be that much better. But then to shift gears from that to a very different kind of news, we gotta talk about this Justin Baldoni-Blake Lively situation, because we just got a huge update. Because Baldoni, he just took a huge L in his legal battle against Lively, but understand, the case is still far from over. Because yesterday you had a judge dismissing the $400 million lawsuit that Justin had filed against Blake, where he accused her and her husband Ryan Reynolds of defamation and extortion. Which, to give you just enough background for those that haven't lived and breathed this story, with Blake and Justin starred in the film It Ends With Us, which Justin also directed, with the two not walking off that set as friends, to say the least. Right in December, you had Blake filing a civil complaint and then eventually a lawsuit where she claimed she was sexually harassed and then retaliated against during production. And then in January, you had Justin and his production company filing his lawsuit, where he accused Blake, Ryan, and their publicist of trying to destroy his career and take over control of the film. And then actually, he also sued the New York Times, which was the first outlet to report on Blake's allegations. But then all of that bringing us to yesterday, where you had a judge tossing out his complaints, ruling that the allegations that Blake made in her suit are exempt from libel claims, and that Justin's assertions that Blake stole creative control of the movie, they don't count as extortion. With the judge writing that the complaint did not adequately state that Blake's, quote, threats were wrongful extortion rather than legally permissible hard bargaining or renegotiation of working conditions. And a very big thing that a number of people have really missed is that the judge left the door open for Justin's camp to pursue different claims related to Blake potentially breaching her contract. But still, overall, right, this is considered a massive win for Blake, and so you had her team celebrating the news and calling the judge's decision a total victory and complete vindication, adding, as we have said from day one, this $400 million lawsuit was a sham and the court saw right through it. We look forward to the next round, which is seeking attorney's fees, treble damages, and punitive damages against Baldoni, Sarowitz, Nathan, and the other Wayfarer parties who perpetrated this abusive litigation. You then also had Blake Lively addressing the news herself on on Instagram sharing resources and organizations that provide legal help to women who need it and writing. Like so many others, I felt the pain of a retaliatory lawsuit, including the manufactured shame that tries to break us. Well, the suit against me was defeated. So many don't have the resources to fight back. And adding, I'm more resolved than ever to continue to stand for every woman's right to have a voice in protecting themselves, including their safety, their integrity, their dignity, and their story. Right? And then, on top of all of that, you had the judge also dismissing the claims that Justin levied against the New York Times as well, which is why you then had a spokesperson for the Times saying, we are grateful to the court for seeing the lawsuit for what it was, a meritless attempt to stifle honest reporting. Our journalists went out and covered carefully and fairly a story of public importance, and the court recognized the law is designed to protect just that sort of journalism. But then with that, as far as where does that leave the case, I mean, well, Blake's lawsuit, that's still ongoing. Last week, she ended up dropping 2 of her emotional distress claims against Justin, with her lawyers there saying they were simply streamlining and focusing the case, with that trial still set for spring of next year. But then separate from that, it looks like Justin's team might still be fighting back. And that because today, his attorney, Brian Friedman, gave a statement to TMZ saying, while the court dismissed the defamation-related claims, the court has invited us to amend 4 out of the 7 claims against Miss Lively, which will showcase additional evidence and refined allegations. And adding, Miss Lively's own claims are no truer today than they were yesterday, and with the facts on our side, we march forward with the same confidence that we had when Miss Lively and her cohorts initiated this battle, and look forward to her forthcoming deposition, which I will be taking. So really, this story isn't going to be going anywhere anytime soon. And then, as far as the public reaction to the news, depending on where you go, very different reactions. So I will say, if you go to Blake's Instagram comments, you'll see tons of people accusing her of paying the judge off, others on Twitter continuing to slam her. But then, on the other side, you have people saying that they're glad that Justin is facing consequences for trying to use the courts to run a smear campaign, and some overall calling this a victory for women. But even that camp isn't universal, because you have those who, seem to support Blake saying this doesn't actually look like a loss for Justin right now, because even if the case was dismissed, they believe that he's going for the court of public opinion anyway. So a lot of different takes, a lot of different opinions, a lot of different reactions, and while we wait to see what happens here, I'd love to hear your thoughts in those comments down below. But then from that, next up today, we've got to talk about how over a dozen states are now desperately trying to stop Trump from giving what some people call machine guns to convicted felons in their communities. Which I know just sounds like a crazy sentence, but let me explain. Right, so machine guns are heavily regulated under federal law. They have been for decades. But then along came these things called bump stocks, which effectively make semi-automatic rifles more closely mirror fully automatic machine guns by bumping the rifle back and forth, rapidly pulling the trigger. We saw the carnage that it could do in the 2017 mass shooting in Las Vegas, where you had a gunman firing over 1,000 rounds in just 11 minutes, killing 60 people and wounding hundreds more. And actually, in response to that, you had President Trump banning bump stocks in 2018. But then what you saw is that in 2020, this company called Rare Breed Triggers started selling a new product they called a forced reset trigger. And like the bump stock, it effectively makes semi-automatic weapons mirror fully automatic ones by snapping the trigger forward every time it's pulled back. But then in 2022, you had the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives determining that the forced reset trigger was illegal, with them arguing that because constant finger pressure on the trigger keeps the gun firing, it essentially is indistinguishable from a machine gun, even if the internal firing mechanism is semi-automatic. So Biden's DOJ took Rare Breed Triggers and its dealers to court, and they seized more than 12,000 triggers from gun stores and individuals. But then, fast forward to last year, you have the Supreme Court striking down Trump's bump stock ban, with Clarence Thomas arguing that since technically the bump stock does not make the gun fire more than 1 bullet per squeeze of the trigger, it just lets the user pull the trigger over and over really fast, it doesn't meet the definition of a machine gun. Or in other words, a bump stock does not convert a semi-automatic rifle into a machine gun any more than a shooter with a lightning-fast trigger finger does. And so then the gun rights groups were like, well, if that's the case for bump stocks, why shouldn't it be true for forced reset triggers as well? And later in the year, you had a federal judge agreeing, ordering that the ATF return any triggers that it seized from the parties to the lawsuit. But then you had the Biden administration being like, wait, hold on. First of all, we're appealing, and secondly, if we're going to return these dangerous weapons, we're going to do it carefully and legally. Namely, by conducting background checks on anyone who asked for their triggers back and exempting states where the triggers were banned. And that is also the position that the ATF maintained until Trump got his people in April. Within the White House in May, settling the lawsuit and effectively handing a free win to the gun industry, which may or may not have to do with the fact that David Warrington, lawyer who's now Trump's White House counsel, previously represented Rare Breed Triggers. But anyway, in this settlement, you had the company agreeing not to make forced reset triggers for handguns, but only on the condition that the ATF stop enforcing the ban on forced reset triggers as a whole. And then on top of that, the ATF would return triggers not only to the plaintiffs in the suit, but to anyone whose trigger was seized or voluntarily handed over. With that, even including convicted felons who were barred from owning guns and to people in states that banned them. With Bondi saying at the time, the Department of Justice believes that the Second Amendment is not a second-class right. We are glad to end a needless cycle of litigation with a settlement that will enhance public safety. And this is you, the president of Rare Breed Triggers, celebrating.
If I seem a little bit lighter today with a little less anger in my eyes and a little less stress on my face, It's not because my wife has me on an amazing skincare regimen. It's because we did it. We beat the ATF.
But now, the update is that 15 states and DC are suing the federal government and seeking a preliminary injunction to prevent the triggers from going back out there. With them arguing that not only does the settlement go far beyond what the federal judge mandated last year and constitute an obvious threat to public safety, he said it also subjects the states to significant added law enforcement and healthcare costs because of the massive carnage the devices are capable of. With New Jersey's Attorney General speaking for many when he said,
"Public reporting on this issue has suggested that the U.S. Department of Justice forced this settlement over the objections of not only career ATF officials, but even the president's own political appointees at the agency. I wish they would actually stop and think about the carnage that could ensue if you put 12,000 machine guns on the street, irrespective of whose hands they fall into."
So we'll have to wait to see what happens here, whether those triggers go back into private hands or they stay with the Fed. And then you've got even more news in just a minute. But first, you might be savvy enough to spot a scam, but is everyone in your life? But also, to be honest, are you really? Because, fake websites are popping up that look so real they could win design awards and still steal your information. They've gotten so sophisticated, even the most skeptical people I know have been fooled. With me, my biggest concern isn't just my own information, but also making sure my wife and my kids stay safe as well. And it's one of the reasons why I think you gotta use today's sponsor, NordVPN, your digital bodyguard in the chaos that is the new normal. And I've got the whole family on it. The kids love unlocking international Netflix. I use it to hide from targeted ads when I'm Googling whatever normal things I'm definitely Googling. If anyone asks, there was a news story on that thing. And no matter what I'm doing, NordVPN is hiding your IP like a magician on incognito steroids. It encrypts your data with military-grade tech. Your ISP, block. That shady dude in the coffee shop, block. Big brother, back off. And you get access to thousands of servers across the globe, so you can be virtually anywhere while physically in your hoodie and sweats. Stay safe, stay private, stay binge watching that one show that's only on Canadian Netflix. Scan that QR code or head to nordvpn.com/Phil or click the link in the description for a massive discount on a 2-year plan plus 4 bonus months. And it comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So that's nordvpn.com/Phil. But then, next up from that, we gotta talk about how RFK Jr. just fired every single member of a CDC advisory panel that's been shaping the nation's vaccine policy for decades. Right, and as head of the Department of Health and Human Services, he does have the power to appoint and dismiss members, but removing the entire panel at once? That's one, obviously unprecedented, and two, you have experts warning that it could be the latest disaster for public health in the US. And in fact, one of the dismissed committee members said, "I've never seen anything this damaging to public health happen in my lifetime. I'm shocked, it's pretty brazen, this will fundamentally destabilize vaccination in America." Right, and as far as the panel in question, it's officially called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP for short. It's made up of epidemiologists, infectious disease physicians, pediatricians, and other experts. And their job is to carefully review vaccine data, debate the evidence, and ultimately decide who should get what shots and when. With a huge key consideration here being that insurance companies and government programs like Medicaid, they're required to cover the vaccines recommended by the panel. A panel that has long been considered a nonpartisan entity, with its members serving 4-year overlapping terms, which also means that the Biden administration just happened to appoint all 17 of the members who have just been let go. And that including 13 who were only appointed to the panel last year, with Kennedy writing in a Wall Street Journal opinion piece announcing what he called the retiring of the committee members, that a clean sweep is needed to reestablish public confidence in vaccine science. And then with that, you had him trying to justify the move by claiming the committee has been plagued with persistent conflicts of interest and has become little more than a rubber stamp for any vaccine. Though notably, that's something that many experts have pushed back on, right? Arguing for one, committee members can't hold stocks or serve on advisory boards or bureaus affiliated with vaccine manufacturers, and saying that while it is true that some members may have ties to the pharmaceutical or vaccine industry, experts say that those often exist for legitimate reasons having to do with their research. And in any case, if ACIP members do have this type of conflict of interest, for example, if an institution that they work at receives money from a drug manufacturer, they disclose it and then recuse themselves from related votes. And in fact, if you go to the CDC's webpage for conflicts of interest, it shows that one current member had recused herself from votes on a handful of vaccines because she had worked on clinical trials for their manufacturers. And so you had that. Well, you also had Kennedy, who didn't provide any specific evidence to support his claim, saying that most of ACIP's members have received substantial funding from pharmaceutical companies, including those marketing vaccines. But he actually seemingly had to go back to 1997 to find a specific example that he said showed conflicts of interest resulting in the approval of a vaccine that shouldn't have been, with him also pointing to a 2009 HHS Inspector General report, which he said showed 97% of committee committee members fail to complete full conflict of interest forms, but that's misleading. Right? Because in addition to, being just from so long ago, that report, it covers all 17 CDC advisory committees that existed at the time, not just ACIP. And it didn't find serious conflicts among most members. It just found that 97% of the financial disclosure forms filed contained errors or omissions, like putting information in the wrong section or forgetting the initial and date amendments to the pages. But of course, that's also not the only thing that Kennedy said that faced resistance. For example, you also had him claiming that the committee, quote, has never recommended against a vaccine, even though it was later withdrawn for safety reasons, and that, quote, it has failed to scrutinize vaccine products given to babies and pregnant women, and adding, to make matters worse, the groups that inform ACIP meet behind closed doors, violating the legal and ethical principle of transparency crucial to maintaining public trust. But, with all that, while individual work groups may meet in private, the meetings of the committee, as well as materials presented to the members, they're public. And similarly, while it's true that the committee doesn't really straight up recommend against vaccines, it's important to note that its role is to come up for guidance for vaccines already licensed or authorized by the FDA. And then finally, contrary to what Kennedy has argued, ACIP hasn't always just acted as a rubber stamp, with, for example, in certain cases, it recommending more restricted use of vaccines than their approval under the FDA would permit. And notably, the committee is scheduled to meet from June 25th to the 27th to discuss vaccinations for COVID-19, RSV, influenza, and more. And with that, you have the HHS saying that meeting is still going to happen, and they've given the agency roughly 2 weeks to fill its advisory panel. A move that had at least one law professor specialized in public health law saying appointing people this fast means they were not properly vetted and there is no real time to check conflict of interest issues. And adding this will not restore trust in vaccines and is not designed to do so. Right? And that is, we've been seeing similar and even far harsher criticism from doctors, professors, former officials, and virtually every reputable health organization in the country. For example, one former director of the CDC saying, we'll look back at this as a grave mistake that sacrificed decades of scientific rigor, undermined public trust, and opened the door for fringe theories rather than facts. And adding, if this leads to vaccines not being recommended, millions of people could lose access, pay more for vaccines and for preventable illnesses, and children will be at greater risk of diseases we haven't faced in decades. And that is, you had the president of the American Medical Association saying this upends a transparent process that has saved countless lives. And the chair of the Infectious Disease Committee for the American Academy of Pediatrics claimed this is an unmitigated public health disaster, with him adding, Mr. Kennedy has no interest in science or saving lives. We have entered into a dangerous time for the health of the country. But of course, with all of this, we have to combine it with the context of everything else that's happened. Because before this, Kennedy already took the unusual step of changing COVID-19 recommendations without first consulting the committee. He's also cut billions of dollars to state health agencies, including funds needed to modernize state programs for child immunization. And he's done things like halted funding for researchers who study vaccine hesitancy and canceled programs intended to discover new vaccines to prevent future pandemics. So obviously, a lot of people have been concerned and worried about the direction we're heading, but what we're seeing here, it's been described as one of the most troubling moves yet. But then from that, as we begin winding down today's show, I wanted to talk about a different kind of news. It's a human interest piece, and it's centered on Glenn Edwards. So it starts all the way back in November of 2023 when a massive fire broke out at the Station Hill development site in Reading in the UK. And at the peak of the blaze, more than 50 firefighters were on the scene from fire stations across the country, with video then capturing a crane operator rescuing a guy trapped on top of a burning building. And that crane operator, it was Glenn Edwards, and it certainly wasn't easy. With Glenn saying he couldn't see anything because of the smoke, and he relied on radio communication in order to position the rescue cage correctly. With Glenn adding, I had so much noise up there with the alarms, it was quite buzzy. When I landed the rescue cradle as he just touched down, I could feel the weight. I could hear the crowd, but I couldn't see him. I was 100% blind. And as the smoke cleared, both literally and figuratively, Glenn was hailed a hero. The chief fire officer at Royal Berkshire Fire and Rescue saying that without Glenn's, quote, incredibly skillful rescue, this could have turned out to be an entirely different situation. With Glenn then getting called the Bruce Willis of Reading, and he was honored with a string of awards, including the Commendation Medal by the British Fire Services Association. But all of this is he's not quite on board with the title of hero, with him saying in an interview with BBC.
Do you feel like a hero?
No, not one bit. I've done what I had to do. I was there, I was in the crane, I got the man, he went home to his friends and family, and happy days, that's the main thing at the end of the day.
Right in the months following the rescue, a GoFundMe was launched to thank Glenn for his service, and it raised thousands of pounds. But that also wasn't the only time that Glenn was in the news, because the next time he made headlines for a much less positive reason, and that was he was diagnosed with cancer. With Glenn telling the BBC, I had cancer in the tongue in February when I rescued the guy. I got that cleared up with radiotherapy, but then in the next breath, after I had a full body scan, the consultant told me that I had cancer in my spine in 5 places. I've been undergoing chemotherapy, but it has grown, to cut a long story short. Stewart. And that is actually where the second half of this story comes in, because upon learning of Glenn's diagnosis, you had a local charity by the name of Bucket List Wishes stepping in. And they're this charity that grants wishes for terminally ill adults that live around Berkshire. It was founded by a woman by the name of Jeannie Hackett after her mother received a terminal diagnosis, and Jeannie's continued making the wishes of other adults come true in her mother's memory. And so for Glenn, rather than having a lavish vacation or some bougie cruise, his wish was just some help moving house, maybe some new floors. And that it's exactly what Bucket List Wishes did, organizing the whole move for him, getting Glenn and his wife new floors, blinds, an oven, a new shed, and even some vouchers for groceries and bedding. With them even throwing in a fishing expedition for Glenn. And so you had Jeannie saying, "We found this humbling, but also we've been emotional about this because we know how much of a hero Glenn is. Hopefully we have gone over and above and made a quite simple but stressful thing of moving a lot easier for him." And it appears it's done exactly that, with Glenn calling Jeannie an angel and saying, "What she has done for us has been unbelievable. She has taken so much pressure off us." And so, with that, while obviously this deals with a sad situation, I just wanted to take the time to say that Glenn and Jeannie and Bucket List Wishes, you are our BAMFs of the day. Bad things happen in this world, and that's where our attention naturally gravitates to, and it's what we're fed every day. And I think it's important to also take a moment for those that try to do something in the face of all that. But that, my friends, is the end of today's show. Thank you for watching, and remember, I'll see you tomorrow because I got a brand new show for you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific. Love you, mean it, bye.